Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me where and what time you're watching? Thanks. I can't seem to stop thinking about the first time I took an Uber, and not because it was a great experience, quite the opposite actually. It was downright terrifying. I had just wrapped up a long shift and had barely gotten any sleep the night before. If I had my car, I probably wouldn't have wanted to drive anyway, considering how exhausted I was. But it was in the shop due to a brake issue, so I had no choice but to find another way home. Normally, I would have hailed a taxi, but not a single one stopped that day. My friends always raved about Uber like it was the best thing ever, so I figured I'd finally give it a shot. At first, everything seemed fine. The car arrived pretty quickly, though I noticed it didn't have a license plate on the back. I didn't dwell on it too much, though. I was too drained to overthink things. I was practically running on empty, so without hesitation, I got in. At least the car's interior was clean and well kept, unlike the taxis I was used to. The driver was a serious-looking guy who didn't even glance at me. He just sat there in silence for what felt like forever, not moving the car, which made me wonder if I had gotten into the wrong Uber. Just as I was about to ask, the car finally started moving, so I let myself relax, assuming he had just been waiting for traffic to clear. The last thing I remember before dozing off was the busy cityscape outside my window. A sudden jolt woke me up as the car hit a pothole, making me slam against the window. Instantly, I sensed that something was off. It was much darker than it should have been. It was still afternoon, so there should have been plenty of light. But when I glanced outside, my stomach dropped. We were on a desolate road surrounded by a dense forest, a place I didn't recognize at all. My neighborhood looked nothing like this. A creeping unease washed over me, the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. I turned to my right, expecting to see an empty seat, but it wasn't. There was someone sitting there, a shadowy, skeletal figure with unnaturally large eyes that reflected the dim light from the dashboard. The way it stared at me sent shivers down my spine, so much so that for a second, I questioned if I was still dreaming. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are we near my house?" I asked. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The driver didn't respond. He just kept staring, unblinking, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't understand. The longer he looked at me, the more dread curled in my stomach. And then, in a voice that sent ice through my veins, he finally spoke. "He has other plans for you, a new destination. We're almost there." A cold dread wrapped around me. He hadn't blinked once since I woke up, and something about the way he spoke made my blood run cold. His words echoed in my mind, over and over. A new destination? What did that mean? Panic started to creep in, adrenaline surging through me. I had to get out. Now. My eyes darted around the car, searching desperately for an escape, but the forest outside seemed endless, closing in on me. I just wanted to go home, but suddenly, that felt impossible. The car sped up, pushing nearly 100 kilometers per hour, every bump in the road making my heart lurch. It felt like I had been thrown into a horror movie, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't figure out how to escape. The thought of jumping out crossed my mind, but the very idea of it made my blood turn to ice. If I threw myself out of the car at that speed, I would almost certainly die. At best, I'd end up with multiple fractures, so that wasn't exactly an ideal option, though I didn't rule it out as a last resort. But I knew I had to do something. "Could we make a quick stop? I really need to use the bathroom," I said, hoping they'd acknowledge me and ideally let me out. But the two men didn't react at all, as if I hadn't spoken. A few tense minutes passed before the driver finally broke the silence, his voice echoing in the car. "The others will welcome you once this is over." Goosebumps erupted over my skin. The others? Who were they? Where were these men taking me, and what did they want from me? As my mind raced, a car sped past us, its headlights briefly flooding the interior with light. That fleeting moment was enough to make my stomach drop. The man beside me, His face was covered in fresh stitches, as if he had been crudely sewn back together. His wide, unblinking eyes looked as though they had never closed in his life. The sight was so horrifying I could barely keep looking. My mind reeled at how fate had led me to such a nightmare. "You came to us for a reason," the man beside me murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. "He'll be delighted to meet you." Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached out and ran his dry, rough fingers through my hair. A violent shudder ran down my spine. My body froze, unable to process the horror of the moment. But then, sirens. The wail of a police siren cut through the tension like a blade. My heart surged with hope. For the first time since waking up in that nightmare of a car, I saw a glimmer of escape. A patrol car pulled us over and an officer stepped out. He walked up to the driver's side and leaned in. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. Before the driver could respond, I felt something sharp press against my ribs. I didn't need to see it to know what it was. My breath hitched as I turned slightly, just enough to see the man beside me gesture for me to stay quiet. "No, sir," the driver answered flatly. "I don't know." The officer gave him a hard look. "You were going nearly 30 kilometers over the speed limit. That's reckless, especially at night. And your headlights? They're out. This whole situation is a mess." As he spoke, he stepped closer, glancing into the back seat. His gaze met mine. In that instant, I felt as though my terror reached him, silently pleading for help. His face shifted, his expression turning serious. "Hey you," he said, narrowing his eyes. "I think I recognize you. There's a warrant out for your arrest." Panic slammed into me. "What? An arrest warrant?" I barely had time to react before the officer opened the car door and yanked me out. In a swift motion, he pulled my arms behind my back and began cuffing me. I nearly screamed, but I held it in. The two men in the car stayed eerily silent. I felt a moment of relief. Finally, I was out of that car, but I wasn't safe yet. My pulse pounded as I thought about what might happen next. Would those maniacs attack the officer? Were they armed? Was this all some elaborate trap? I had no idea what was going on. I only knew I needed to get away. The officer, sensing my distress, leaned in close as he led me to the patrol car. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I know you need help," he said. "I'm a cop. I could see the fear in your eyes from a mile away. I see it every day." And just like that, everything hit me. All the fear, all the tension, everything I had been holding back. It came rushing out in uncontrollable sobs. The officer didn't say anything else, didn't seem annoyed. He just let me cry. After a while, he even offered to drive me home and stay for a bit in case those men came back. Of course, I accepted. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping that night. That night was one of the worst of my life. The trauma haunted me for months. It took me more than 2 years to set foot in another Uber. Those men never resurfaced. I never found out who they were or what they had planned for me, and I didn't want to. I didn't even want to imagine what might have happened if that patrol car hadn't stopped us. That officer was my guardian angel that night, and I can only pray I never cross paths with those lunatics again. Hi, my name is Simon. There was a time when everything in my life completely fell apart. I lost my job at the university where I had been a professor for years, but that was just one of many problems I faced. My marriage was falling apart. My wife and I couldn't stand each other. I also had a teenage daughter who had become a constant source of stress. Her life was a mess. She barely spent time at home, had more boyfriends than I could count, struggled with alcohol, and had started taking medication. I even suspected she was dealing with an illness, possibly HIV. She had always been a beautiful girl, which made it easier for her to get money from others. In the end, all of this led to a messy divorce, and I had to leave our family home to live on my own. But to be honest, when I walked away from those two women, my ex-wife and my daughter, I felt nothing. I hated watching my family fall apart. but for my own mental well-being, I wanted nothing more to do with them. At that point in my life, I had to reevaluate everything. I needed a new place to live and a fresh start. Fortunately, I had enough savings to rent a decent apartment, and I decided to try my luck as an Uber driver. Of course, I could have found a higher-paying job, but my mind was elsewhere. I felt like a ship lost at sea, and I figured that driving, visiting different places, and meeting new people might be a good way to distract myself. Besides, I had always loved driving. It was like stress therapy for me. The first few weeks were a mix of excitement and nerves. There was a certain thrill to it that I genuinely enjoyed. I drove all kinds of passengers. Some were dull, some were completely drunk or angry, and some turned out to be surprisingly interesting. But there was one thing I particularly liked: beautiful women, especially when they were alone or with their friends. Everything was going fairly well until, after about a month of working for Uber, something happened that was far from pleasant. On one of my routes, I picked up a young guy. He couldn't have been more than a teenager, and there was something unsettling about him. He was trembling and drenched in sweat, his long blonde hair falling over his face. "Hey mate, are you okay?" I asked, feeling concerned. Not just about his condition, but also whether he'd be able to pay for the ride. More than anything, I didn't want him throwing up in my car. "Are you all right, mate? Do you have enough money?" I blurted out, trying to sound casual. "Yes, I'm fine. Just feeling a bit sick, but I can pay," he replied. His tone made me suspect he just needed his daily fix of something, so I didn't dwell on it. Finally, we reached his destination, an old house on a dark, desolate street. He paid me just as he had promised, so I turned around and drove off to continue my shift. But as I made my way back, I saw a woman lying on the sidewalk in that awful neighborhood. At first, I assumed she was just drunk or high, but as I got closer, I noticed she was young, and the way she was positioned was dangerous. Nearly half her body was off the curb, and her right arm stretched out in a way that any passing car could hit her. I felt a pang of pity and decided to check if she needed help. I pulled over a little ahead, got out, and approached her, though I wasn't even sure if she was alive. My subconscious made an instant connection to my daughter. I imagined her ending up in a situation like this, and it shattered me. "Hey, do you need help? It's not safe lying out here on the street," I said, stepping closer. She didn't react, so I hesitantly reached out to check if she was breathing. To my surprise, she suddenly stirred. "Hey, get away from me, this is a free country," she snapped, spitting the words at me. She was really young, or at least she seemed so. Thin, with dark, lifeless eyes that matched her tangled hair. "Hi, my name is Larry. Let me help you. This isn't the life you should be living. How old are you? Do you want me to call your family?" I asked, not thinking much about my words, only that it felt like the right thing to do. "I'm old enough to be your daughter, and I'm off duty tonight, so save your fantasies for another time," she retorted. "I don't want anything from you," I said firmly. "I just want to help. I can take you to a shelter if you'd like." "I heard you the first time, Larry," she scoffed. "I'm just a drug addict, not deaf. And I'm not hungry either. So unless you're offering me a bunch of money, just leave." At that moment, something inside me shifted. A realization, an undeniable truth. This girl was lost. There was no going back for her. There was only one escape, one way to free her from this misery. "Hey, why are you looking at me like that? Why are you crying? Are you crazy? Get away," she shouted, but a dark impulse took over me. With tears in my eyes and a sickening weight in my chest, I grabbed her by the neck with one hand and covered her mouth with the other. Her eyes widened in shock, confusion flashing across her face as I strangled her. It was over quickly, quick enough that she didn't suffer too much. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I convinced myself that she would feel it too. I hid her body behind some nearby bushes. My shift wasn't over yet, but I didn't want to leave the situation unresolved. Hours later, when my work was done, I returned for her. The night was deep and silent. No one had seen us, and even if they had, who would care? I wrapped her in a large blanket and took her to my apartment. My building had its own garage, making it easy to move her without attracting attention. It was close to midnight, and as a former professor of forensic medicine, I knew exactly what was required to dissect and embalm a body. So, that's what I did. Over the following days, I carefully removed the organs that would decay quickly, but I preserved her skin, eyes, and hair with chemicals. I did a meticulous job. She looked more alive than ever. I even found an ID in her pocket. Her name was Ariadna. She was only a teenager. Now she was safe. She was home. In a cold, hidden room I had prepared for her. There she would be at peace forever. It was yet another night of work, and though I wasn't exactly excited about it, my rent was already weeks overdue. I had spent everything I had on new tires and an oil change for my car, so there was no excuse left for my landlord. He had warned me just last month. If I was late again, I'd be out on the street. As you might expect, he wasn't the most sympathetic guy. So there I was, driving through the night, picking up all sorts of passengers, young people, workaholics, and drunks, all for the miserable pay that Uber offered. But I couldn't afford to lose my job. Since moving to this quiet coastal town a few months ago, I had no family or friends to rely on. Truthfully, I despised driving at night because passing by the water unsettled me. There was something eerie about that thick mist covering the sky, like driving over a fog-draped bridge. It was the kind of moment when you wouldn't dare glance into the rearview mirror. That night, I had just dropped off a couple of drunk passengers at a bar when I got another ride request. Glancing at my phone, I assumed it would be a quick, uneventful trip, probably just another person leaving a bar. As I drove toward the pickup location, I realized it was the exact same place I had dropped off the couple only 30 minutes earlier. At first, it didn't seem particularly odd, just an odd coincidence. But as I got closer, an unsettling layer of fog thickened around me, making the hairs on my arms stand up. A strange feeling crept over me, so I honked the horn, hoping someone would appear, but no one did. Checking my phone again, the pickup location seemed correct. Suddenly, the rear door on the driver's side flew open with a loud bang, making my heart skip a beat. Hello? I said, my voice unsteady. I tried to chuckle, hoping to shake off the tension, though I felt a tight lump in my throat. The man who got in was large and completely silent. He sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, clutching a brown paper bag tightly against his side. "Want me to drop you off just a block away?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound calm. "I just want to be sure there's no mistake." At last he spoke. His voice was low and rough. "It must be a mistake." He paused. As if he were about to say more, he hesitated but then continued, "I'm a friend of the couple you were just talking to." His answer caught me off guard. "Really?" I responded automatically. "Yeah, they just wanted to leave separately," he said casually. That's when I recalled seeing them kissing before they got out. So, in a way, it made sense that they'd want to go their own ways. Still, something about it felt strange, though I was too nervous to question it. I entered the address they had given into the GPS and started driving. Every now and then I glanced back, not out of nervousness, but because that brown bag kept drawing my attention. I couldn't help but wonder if it contained something amusing, like beer, sandwiches, or maybe even weed. Who knows? The guy had a serious expression and, well, you know what they say about silent types. But another thought crept in. What if he had a weapon in there? Just as I was lost in my thoughts, my phone suddenly rang, making me nearly jump out of my seat. It was an Uber notification, another passenger request right on our route. That struck me as odd since it was already past 3 in the morning. Still, I wasn't annoyed. In fact, I felt relieved. More people in the car meant I wouldn't be alone with the unsettling guy in the back. When we reached the pickup point, I spotted the passenger easily, a girl standing beneath a streetlight. Compared to my last pickup, this was a relief. She was bundled up against the cold, and it was clear she had been waiting for a while. But something in her expression made me pause. She looked a little uneasy, as if something was off. Right then, the air inside the car felt heavier, and I didn't like it one bit. As she approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Normally, I'd have her sit in the back, but with that strange guy there, I preferred she take the passenger seat. She quickly opened the door and got in with a quiet, "Hello?" her voice barely audible in the chilly night. Her eyes were distant, as if she had just seen something terrifying. She forced a smile, but her gaze stayed fixed forward. I decided not to ask any questions. As we drove, I noticed something unsettling. The address she provided matched that of the couple I had dropped off earlier. My curiosity and unease grew. I glanced at the girl beside me and asked, "Do you know the guy sitting behind me?" Her reaction made my stomach tighten. First, she turned to look at him. Then, she smiled at me and said with unnerving confidence, "Yes?" I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. The air inside the car felt thick, charged with tension. Something strange was happening, but there was nothing I could do about it. Just had to drop them off and then finally get some rest. A few more minutes and it would all be over. But when we arrived, the house was completely dark. The man got out first and walked toward it. The girl lingered, closing the door behind her. Then, before heading off, she turned to me and said, "Just wait a minute. We forgot something. We'll be right back." She smiled, and for some reason, that expression sent an uneasy feeling through my stomach. Sure, go ahead," I replied, feeling foolish for even saying it. The door shut behind her, and everything fell eerily silent. I sat there, staring at the darkness, debating whether I should just leave. Before I could make up my mind, a loud thud struck the passenger window. My heart leapt into my throat. I turned quickly, pulse racing, and saw the girl again. But now, her face was pale. "Please, hurry. My friend needs help," she said urgently. I didn't know what to think, but something in her voice made my chest tighten with fear. If she was scared, then maybe I should be too. "There's blood," she nearly shouted. "We need to take her to the hospital." That was all it took for a wave of panic to crash over me. My chest tightened as fear surged through me. Without thinking, I turned off the engine and got out, following the girl toward the house. But as we neared the front door, I suddenly froze. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, only to see the guy standing there, holding a blood-stained knife in his hand. Oh no. Terror gripped me as the girl slowly turned to face me, her lips curling into a chilling smile. Then, in a voice dripping with amusement, she whispered, "Run." Chaos erupted. I bolted for the door, but it was already too late. The guy lunged, shoving me hard to the floor. I hit the ground with a painful thud, my breath knocked out of me. My mind struggled to process what was happening, why this was happening. I tried to scream, but fear had locked my voice in my throat. The girl had vanished, yet her eerie laughter echoed in my head. Desperate, I crawled across the floor, my hands slipping in something warm and sticky. The moment I realized it was blood, a deep horror settled into my bones. And then I saw it. The couple from earlier, the ones I had dropped off at the bar, were sitting at the dining table, their throats brutally slit. The scene was nightmarish, beyond anything my mind could comprehend. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then suddenly, the guy appeared behind me. Driven by sheer survival instinct, I leaped to my feet just as he hurled the knife at me. It missed, barely. In that instant, I saw him slip in the pool of blood. This was my chance. I ran, my screams piercing the silence as I sprinted up the stairs, my entire body drenched in cold sweat. The girl's laughter rang out again, but this time it seemed to come from deeper inside the house. My pulse pounded as I reached the top and spotted a slightly open door. No other choice. I threw myself inside and scrambled into a closet, pressing my trembling hands over my mouth to keep from sobbing. Tears streamed down my cheeks, mixing with the blood that covered my skin. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, heavy footsteps. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of death, growing louder, closer. My heart pounded as I silently pleaded for him to walk past. Just when I thought I was doomed, police sirens. The wailing sound of salvation split through the night, filling me with a desperate, fragile hope. I heard hurried footsteps retreating, then silence. Cautiously, I waited before pushing the closet door open. My legs gave out and I collapsed to my knees, praying that the officers would get here in time. But by the time they stormed the house, the killers were gone. I had survived the worst Uber ride of my life. Months later, the pair of psychopaths were finally caught and sentenced to death, but not before they had claimed 4 more victims. That night haunted me forever. It all began with alcohol. Every Saturday, I would roam the city streets, pouring bottles down my throat until my liver had enough. Then I'd take a cab home, forcing the poor driver to endure my endless complaints and chatter, which must have been unbearable. But there was one night that stood out. That evening, I met up with some colleagues at a local bar, drinking wine as if there was no tomorrow. The warmth of the alcohol left me feeling pleasantly drunk, so I decided to step outside and hail a cab to take me home. However, no matter how many taxis I tried to flag down, they were all occupied or simply refused me. That's when I recalled a new car service my friend Kaylee had mentioned a few nights earlier. With a bit of hesitation, I downloaded the app, and soon enough I was accepting the terms and conditions. Finally, my phone screen lit up, showing that a driver named Tom was on his way. The issue was he had no ratings or reviews. Being new to this, I had my doubts, but with so much alcohol in my system, I didn't have many choices. If I didn't want to spend the night passed out on the sidewalk, vulnerable to whoever came by, I had to be patient. A few minutes later, a black Volvo pulled up in front of me. I was dizzy, but I managed to stay on my feet, approach the car, open the door, and get inside. "Is this my Uber?" I muttered, struggling to form coherent words. The driver didn't respond. In fact, he seemed startled that I had entered. Though his reaction was odd, I didn't dwell on it. After all, it wasn't my first time getting into a car while drunk. Once I closed the door and provided my address, the vehicle began moving toward what I assumed was my apartment. At that moment, silence filled the car, and I found myself watching the shadows of trees as we drove deeper into the darkness. I didn't live far from the center, so traveling down these rural roads felt strange, but I didn't question it too much. I was more focused on fighting the urge to vomit than on the route we were taking. Eventually, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Are we there yet?" I asked, my voice sharper than before. "I'm sorry, but I'm really tired. Could we get home sometime tonight?" I tried to sound sarcastic, but exhaustion and alcohol were testing my patience. I knew full well it shouldn't take this long unless Tom was taking a detour. The guy seemed irritated by my question, which made me uneasy. Maybe I should offer a generous tip to get home faster. But then, as I took out my phone to use Apple Pay, something caught my attention. I had several missed calls and messages from someone claiming to be my actual Uber driver. He said he was in a blue BMW and was wondering where I was since he had been waiting in front of the bar but couldn't see me. As I tried to piece things together, a wave of fear washed over me. What was happening? My unease grew as I attempted to ask the driver about my location, just to gauge how lost I was. He responded curtly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in trouble. With every passing second, drowsiness and alcohol took hold of me, and I began to realize I had made a grave mistake. The streetlights flickered as we sped down those deserted dark roads. I felt trapped in a nightmare, my mind racing. "Are we there yet?" I asked again, this time with growing alarm. The man remained silent, staring straight ahead as if lost in his own world. And there I was, my head clouded with fear and confusion, knowing I had to act. But the alcohol blurred my thoughts. At that moment, the car swerved sharply, and the trees around us seemed to grow darker. It was then that something inside me clicked. I was on a journey I didn't even recognize. None of this was normal. The instant I realized it, every fiber of my being screamed at me to escape. But what could I do? I was trapped with a stranger on an uncertain path, my heart pounding wildly. I knew this situation was dangerous, but I was too drunk to think clearly. Anxiety started to take hold as the car pressed forward, passing through increasingly isolated areas. With every second, the tension mounted. This so-called Tom remained silent while my unease intensified. This was no longer just a ride home. It had become a fight for survival. It was clear this man had sinister intentions. In that instant, I looked up and locked eyes with the crazed stare of an aged man, his wrinkled face stretched into a chilling grin, as if he had crawled straight from the underworld. His wicked smile stretched ear to ear, and when he finally spoke, my blood turned to ice. "If you call anyone, I'll kill you." His words sent a wave of terror through me. I gasped, recoiling into my seat. Frantically, I pounded on the door, hoping someone might hear my distress, but it was useless. Peering through the window, I saw nothing but a dark, deserted country road. There wasn't a single soul in sight. My breath came in rapid gasps as fear seized my chest, and then the driver sped up. "Yes, you're mine now. Let's have some fun," he sneered, waving a knife in his hand. Just as I thought there was no escape, a sudden blue flash appeared in the distance. It was a police car. Its sirens wailed, shattering the silence of the forest. The driver tensed, quickly shoving the knife under his seat as the car screeched to a halt. Within seconds, 2 officers rushed forward, tasers drawn, yanking him from the vehicle like a rag doll. I sat frozen, struggling to comprehend what was happening. I had no recollection of calling the police, so confusion clouded my thoughts. After securing him in handcuffs and tossing him into the back of their patrol car, one officer approached me. "Are you all right, miss?" The flood of relief hit me like a freight train, washing away my terror. The tension I had been holding in came rushing back, and suddenly I broke down in uncontrollable sobs. The realization of how close I had come to falling victim to a predator overwhelmed me. Through gasps and shaky breaths, I told the officers everything. The man, the nightmare of that night, and how the alcohol had clouded my judgment. Once I managed to regain my composure, I pointed to the hidden knife. The officers informed me that they had already known where to find me before arriving. The taxi app's tracking features had allowed my real driver to notice that I was headed in the opposite direction of my intended destination. Realizing something was wrong, he immediately alerted the police. They had been pursuing us because the lunatic had attempted to take me somewhere deep in the woods, somewhere terrifying. On my way home, I reflected on the horror of what had just transpired. If it hadn't been for the real Tom, I could have been in unimaginable danger. Since that night, I've made a conscious effort to stay sober and alert, but the memory of that twisted grin continues to haunt me. Sometimes when I glance in the rearview mirror of my own car, I see it staring back at me, those dark eyes lurking, waiting for an opportunity to return. I never imagined that a night of drinking could lead me to such a nightmare. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the pulse of that terror lurking in the shadows, stalking me. Hi, I'm Mark, and I've been driving for Uber for a few years now. But before that, I spent several years as a truck driver. Over the years, I've encountered some strange things on the road, but nothing compares to what happened to me one night. And believe me, I'm not easily shocked. It all began on a typical evening. You might not know this, but Uber drivers don't just transport passengers. We sometimes carry packages as well. That night, I was doing a few short trips when I got a notification on the app. I had to pick up a small box. The customer, named Peter, asked me to deliver it to his girlfriend, who worked at a 24-hour veterinary clinic. I don't usually get these kinds of orders, but I thought I'd take the chance. It's not that the pay is better, but after so many years on the road, I sometimes miss the solitude of long drives. Eventually, I arrived at the pickup location, which was a run-down apartment in a quiet suburb to the north of the city. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, so I wasn't too worried while waiting for Peter, though the place did give off an eerie vibe. While waiting, I checked the details again and remembered that I was supposed to go to the vet and ask for Haley. The box was a surprise for her, But then a thought crossed my mind. If it was a surprise, why didn't Peter just deliver it himself instead of using Uber? I kept thinking about it, but time was ticking and Peter still hadn't shown up. Suddenly, I saw someone peeking through the apartment door. I waved at him and quickly looked at the app to confirm Peter's name. Then, out of nowhere, he appeared right next to me. "Peter, right?" I asked. "Sorry I'm late," he said, with an overly friendly smile that honestly made me uncomfortable, almost as if it were forced. There was something off about him. He didn't seem dangerous, but he had that unsettling vibe. "Is everything okay?" I asked him. He smiled again and reassured me. "Yes, everything's fine. You're here to take the box to the vet, right? If Haley asks anything unusual, just tell her I'm the one who sent it." He gave me a description of her, and despite his odd behavior, I decided to go ahead with the delivery. His tone was strange, but I didn't want to make a scene. "Make sure she believes me," he added. By the time I glanced back at the door, Peter had disappeared. The door was still shut, there was no elevator nearby, and no one else was around. I felt uneasy and just wanted to leave. I drove a few blocks to the veterinary clinic. When I arrived, the place seemed oddly quiet for a 24-hour vet, but I didn't think too much of it. I simply asked for Haley, and when I saw her come out, she gave me a curious look. I handed Haley the box, and what happened next left me completely confused. As soon as she heard Peter's name, her eyes widened, and she started crying before running off. I barely had time to process what was going on when another vet staff member stormed over, angrily shouting at me to leave. He hurled insults at me, and while I wanted to explain that I was just delivering a package, there was no chance to get a word in. Just as I was thinking of leaving a bad review on the app, I heard a knock on my window. It was Haley, still crying, but she approached my car and, with distress in her voice, asked, "Are you sure Peter gave you that box?" A sense of unease hit me. Why was she so worried? Something didn't feel right, and I began to suspect there was something darker behind the surprise Peter had sent her. The whole situation suddenly felt like a trap. Doubt crept in, and I questioned whether I had made the right choice by getting involved. Things got even more unsettling when Haley pulled out her phone and showed me a picture. The photo showed her and Peter kissing. There was no doubt it was the same guy who'd given me the box. But here's the problem. According to Haley, Peter had disappeared months ago. "This sounds a little strange," I said. "I don't think someone who's missing would send a box instead of just showing up himself." Haley asked if I had been paid for the trip, and when I confirmed, she asked if she could open the box. Inside was a cell phone. When I powered it on, I saw a picture of Peter riding a bicycle. This was starting to get wild. "Can you give me a ride? I'll pay for the last trip," she asked, but I told her I couldn't help, as I had a minimum number of trips to complete with Uber. "It's okay, I understand," she said with disappointment. Still, I couldn't get more involved, especially with how strange everything was. She nodded and walked away, holding the phone in her hand. Just as I was about to accept another ride request, my phone rang. I looked at it and saw it was Haley again. Curious, I accepted the ride. The vet's door opened and Haley stepped out wearing overalls. "Let me explain," she started. She went on to tell me that everything had been fine with Peter, until one day he suddenly disappeared and never returned. She explained how strange things began happening at their home. Objects moving on their own, her room feeling colder, and sometimes she felt as if she was being watched. Then she told me about the time she woke up in the middle of the night to a knock on the door. When she opened it, Peter was standing there, so she excitedly opened the door. But when she looked, there was no one there. "Are you saying Peter is dead?" I asked her, and she nodded, her face full of sadness. "I don't know what to make of this," I said. "Maybe he thought the box had something to do with you." "Why me, though? What does this have to do with me?" I asked. "Maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Haley replied, her tone resigned, leaving a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. As we talked, she glanced at her phone and suddenly asked me to stop the car. I pulled over and she hurriedly got out, running down an empty dirt road. Worried, I followed her and saw her digging frantically. After several minutes, she uncovered something. I froze when I saw it. It was Peter's body. It was already decomposed, and the whole scene was chilling. Haley tried to hug him, but I quickly stopped her. "This is a crime scene. You can't touch him," I said. We called the police, and when they arrived, the case was ruled a homicide. They quickly began investigating, checking cameras, and questioning neighbors. A few days later, they were able to piece together the night Peter disappeared. He had been seen being dragged away by two men, clearly terrified and forced to go with them. According to Haley, they eventually tracked down the men. Each had a different story, but one of them confessed that they had initially tried to rob Peter, but things spiraled out of control, and they ended up beating him to death. After that, Haley and I became close friends. It turned out we were from the same neighborhood. Over time, she was able to rebuild her life, though she still mourned Peter. However, she found peace knowing that he was in a better place and that she finally had answers. One day I was finishing another Uber trip near the apartment where I'd picked up the box. I glanced toward the building and, to my shock, saw Peter standing by the window, head bowed, wearing a smile. It felt like he was silently thanking me, and I was overcome with a sense of peace. Despite all the terrible events, at least there was some form of closure.